All right. Hi, everyone. So this is a continuation of the upper extremity lecture that we started last week. So if you're taking a look at this, like I said, obviously we're not in class today, as you can see, but we're going to be trying to get through this in the same way that we would have if we were in class. So if you do have any questions throughout this, you are absolutely able to mark down which slide you have a question for, and you're more than welcome to shoot me an email, and we can absolutely talk about it. But a little bit of an imperfect situation, but thank you for rolling with the punches for this kind of thing. So. As we were continuing, the first half of this lecture that we discussed when we were actually in class, we talked about the shoulder and the elbow, right? And with the shoulder, we were talking about the level of mobility that the shoulder had, right? We said that that the shoulder had several different motions. It can do flexion, it can do extension, it can do horizontal abduction and adduction, it can do just regular adduction and abduction, it can do internal and external rotation. And then, of course, we talked about the full circumduction, a lot of different motions. And because of that, we have the motion of the glenohumeral joint as well as the scapulothoracic joint that were interacting with one another to help provide all that stability, and of course all the muscles that kind of come along with that. When we moved into the elbow next, we talked a little bit more about stability. Right, there's not nearly as many muscles that work on the elbow specifically. Now, as we're getting into the forearm and the wrist and hand, you'll see that there's going to be a little bit more information to do with how we're actually moving our elbow. But for the elbow specifically, the main muscles that the main agonists that just work with the elbow are, of course, the biceps for elbow flexion and the triceps for elbow extension. Those are things that we already kind of talked about, right? But the reason that was more of a stability sort of situation, remember, the olecranon process, that little hook that sits on the back of the ulna, plugs into the humerus, right? And there's an olecranon fossa on the humerus. So as those two kind of plug into one another, there is a great level of stability that they both are able to have. As a result of that, we have a lot of that stability, but of course, as a result, we don't have nearly as much mobility, right? There's only 2 motions that the elbow can do versus 8 that the shoulder can do. So the theme for the forearm, as we're moving into the forearm, the theme for the forearm is kind of transitional, right? As we're taking a look at the next slides coming up here, one of the things that I want you guys to notice is that once again, just like in the elbow, there's really not very many motions that the forearm can do. But of course, we all know if we were to kind of open and close our hands, we see the muscles moving all the way down, into our forearm and down into our elbow. So the fact that we have all these muscles that are really long, they start from the elbow and they move all the way down into the fingertips, it really does kind of go to show that the forearm itself is a really transitionary part of the body, which is why we have that kind of as the tagline. So when we take a look at the bony anatomy of the forearm, really the only 2 joints that the 2 bones, I should say, that we're looking at are the radius and the ulna. When we take a look at the radius, you can kind of see on this top picture here, I unfortunately don't have very much of an ability to kind of point to anything right now. Keynote doesn't really let me do that, but I'm going to kind of describe things as we're kind of going along here. So if you take a look at the picture up at the top, we can see both the ulna and the radius are labeled with those bold letters right in the middle of that in that picture, right? If we take a look at the ulna, which is, the bone, we can see there's a very large part of one of those bones up at the top of the picture, right? The top of that particular picture is more proximal, and the bottom of that picture is more distal. So when you take a look at that, right, you can see the proximal part of the ulna, which has the olecranon on it, is, very large, and then the distal part of the ulna is very small. You take a look at the radius, which is the other bone, and you can see the exact opposite is true. The proximal aspect of the radius is very small, and the distal part of the radius is very large. So in class, I had mentioned that these 2 bones, you kind of were able to kind of flip them around on one another, and they are very similar in terms of their size, their structure, their anatomy, and everything like that. They're just kind of flipped. Right, so we have a very large part of the ulna that articulates with the humerus to create the elbow joint, and then we have a very large part of the radius that articulates with the wrist bones to make the wrist joint, the carpal bones to make the wrist joint. So we want to try to look into see how these bones are kind of interacting with one another. one of the things that we do take a look at here is, especially you can see up toward the more proximal part of that picture, there is one that's called the tuberosity of the radius, right? So we see right up at the top of the picture, olecranon, radial notch of the ulna, head of the radius, neck of the radius, and then the tuberosity of the radius. You can see how that bump kind of sticks out, right? And that articulates with the ulna, and it creates this kind of what we call the proximal radial ulnar joint, right? And this joint, along with the distal one, where you can see both of those bones kind of interact down at the bottom again, this bone, or these two joints, are what allow this kind of rotation to happen, right? So they're kind of articulating like this, and they can rotate around one another, right? That's what allows us to be able to kind of, to get my hand in the video here, that's what allows us to be able to kind of rotate our hand back and forth in this sort of direction, right? So if we have that direction that we're rotating in, that is what we call, you can see in the bottom picture here, that's what we have, pronation and supination, right? Supination, I was always kind of told, is kind of like you're holding a bowl of soup, right? That one always made sense to me, but I don't know if anybody has played Call of Duty before or any of those shooting games, but there was always one position that you could always go into when you lay on your stomach, you're prone. I don't know, to me that always helped because I was playing video games long before I was studying anatomy, so whenever I heard prone, I know that everything's kind of more face down, right? So whenever we're doing pronation, right, we're kind of putting our hand, pointing our palm downward. When we're doing supination, we're pointing our hand upward. Remember, I can't really do it right now because I'm sitting down, but you won't be able to see it. But remember that if we try to transition that back to the anatomical position, essentially in the anatomical position, our forearm is pronated. We can go further than that, but our forearm is pronated. So I want you to actually try to do that now while you're listening to me rant about this, because I want you to be able to see that's pronation, and then you can, I'm sorry, that's wrong. You are supinated when you do this, right? Your palm is facing forward. That is supination. You can kind of hold your palm and go straight downward. You got supination. From there, you can pronate, which would be when you point your palm behind you. Right, so I want you to try to think about the two different ways that we're able to move the forearm here, right? And when we talk about that again, when we're talking just specifically about the motions of the forearm, which would be pronation and supination, those are the only two, right? You can see the way these bones work. They're very long bones. They just have that ability to kind of cross over one another and kind of do that rotational aspect there. That's about all that they're able to do. And when we think about the muscles that are able to do pronation and supination, there's no secret to the names of those. The muscles that perform pronation are the pronator teres and the pronator quadratus, right? And you can see the big difference between the two of those. Of course, we now want to look at the way that they cross the joints. So we'll start off with the pronator quadratus and note that there is no other joint that it crosses. It just articulates and interacts, with the radius and the ulna, and that's about it, right? But when we take a look at the pronator teres, which is the picture to the left over here on the top, we take a look at that and we can see that there is an origin point that is actually on the humerus. So as we know, whenever a muscle crosses a joint, we'll discuss this in a little bit, but whenever a muscle crosses a joint, it works on that joint. So we're now looking on the anterior surface, or what we call the palmar surface of the forearm right here. So if we have a muscle that goes on the anterior side from our forearm and crosses over our elbow joint, that is also going to help out with elbow flexion. Right? So it does give us the chance to be able to do that. You can even see on this picture specifically, it doesn't even really say that, right? Its big thing, according to the name, of course, is that it performs pronation. But we do know that every time a muscle crosses a joint, it works on that joint. So it might not be the active one that performs elbow flexion. Of course, we know that's the biceps. But we do have a little bit of elbow flexion that comes from the pronator teres as well. And similarly, when we take a look at the picture down at the bottom here, we have supination. And once again, no secret in terms of the name of the muscle that does that. The supinator performs supination. When we take a look at that, though, we also once again see that the supinator crosses over the elbow and has a little bit of an origin point on the humerus itself. So once again, now being on the posterior aspect of the arm, we know that not only is it going to perform supination, but it is also going to help it perform elbow extension slightly as well. But for the most part, again, we have a pronator teres, pronator quadratus. Those, of course, perform pronation. And then we have our supinator muscle, which, of course, performs supination. So again, when we're talking specifically about the forearm, there's really not much that we're going to be talking about in terms of the muscles and the movements and all that kind of stuff. 2 movements, 3 muscles, done and done. But with everything else, there's a lot of connections that kind of come into play here. And that's where we get onto this slide right here, right? The forearm muscles that everybody kind of thinks about are these muscles that span several joints. And again, because of that, they always work on each one of those joints. So getting into the hand and wrist, we're going to be talking a little bit more about each one of these muscles, because as we can see on the slide, these muscles are always named for the most distal joint that they are interacting with, or that they help to control, right? So when we have a muscle that is called, for example, the flexor carpi radialis. That's one of the muscles that we see here. That is the very top picture, the first picture that you're seeing up on this slide. The flexor carpi radialis, if you take a look at the way that muscle runs, you will once again see that it attaches onto the medial epicondyle of the humerus, right? So it attaches onto the humerus, doesn't actually attach at all. There's some fascial connections, but there's no insertion or origin points on the radius or ulna at all. So we don't tend to really consider this to be a forearm muscle from an anatomical perspective, but of course everybody would understand that that would be the case for us all. But when we take a look at this, we can see that, it's a muscle called a flexor, right? So we know that it performs flexion of every muscle that it interacts with. So, for example, we can see that it crosses the elbow joint, so this will help to flex the elbow as well, right? What we're going to see is, of course, we've already discussed the agonist of elbow flexion, which is, of course, the biceps. But throughout the rest of these slides, you'll notice that all of these muscles are really good helpers. They're really good synergists to be able to perform whatever motion, we'll be talking about here. So yes, proximally there. But as we move downward, we can see the attachment points here. I'm just going to read this out to you here. The base of the second and third metacarpals. Now we haven't talked about metacarpals specifically yet, but just like we talked about in the ankle, we have the metatarsals. Those are those kind of long bones in the middle of metatarsals in the foot, metacarpals in the hand. So it's kind of the bones of our palm, right? That kind of sit right there. So it's really at the base. So that muscle attaches, we're talking about the radialis, so that muscle attaches, kind of right down in that area right there. So a flexor carpi radialis muscle means that the most distal joint that it helps to contract would be the carpi joint, otherwise what we would know as the wrist joint. So it helps to flex the wrist, right? But as we get deeper down into these other muscles, we see something called the flexor digitorum superficialis. We'll get into the names of a couple of these different things right here, but the reason I want to put this slide on here, with all these different pictures, is before we even begin to identify these things, I wanted to illustrate that while we, have these forearm muscles, some of which do attach onto the ulna, some of which do attach onto the humerus, whatever the case is, all of these muscles will span several joints. They will control all of those joints. And we talk about it in the wrist and hand because they are named for the most distal joint that they control. So that's what's going on here. The last point to be able to make here, right, is especially if we talk about like the flexor digitorum, which helps to control the fingers, right? I can, just with one muscle, we can see the flexor digitorum superficialis. There's technically a profundus as well. We'll get into that in a second. But, there's one muscle that attaches onto all 4 of those fingers. So I can sit here and I can just move my index finger. I can just move my pinky or my middle or my ring finger. I can do this with every one of my fingers, right? Even though that is just one muscle that is performing all of these different motions, right? And this is why when we get into the wrist and hand, where the big key term here is coordination, right? When we talk about coordination, now we're talking about all the nerves that can come down into my forearm muscles, right? Into that flexor digitorum, whether it's profundus, superficialis, whatever. And there are just so many different nerves that come and they plug into these muscles that if I tell my nerves, my brain tells my nerves to just flex my pinky, I can do that. And then to just extend my pinky. If I want to make a fist for everything except for my index finger, I can do that because I have all of these different nerves that are coming in and innervating just tiny little slivers of these muscles, right? That's what we mean when we talk about coordination in this sense. That, we have so many different nerve innervations into these muscles that it allows us to be able to perform all of these different, really complex different motions, right? We'll get into what that might look like here in a little bit, but I wanted to kind of bring that part into play just so that we all kind of understand exactly how these muscles, these single muscles, help to perform all these really complex different motions, right? So, getting into the bony anatomy and the joints of the wrist and hand, we got a lot going on here, right? There are a ton of bones that kind of come into play. We'll start off most distally, which in this case would be at the top of this picture, with the phalanges, right? And just the same way that we had in the feet, for each one of the digits, right? So the four fingers that we have 3 phalanges in each one of those. And then on our thumb, we only have 2 phalanges. That's, we only have one joint right there. So in each one of the hands, we have 14 phalanges. And then we have 5 metacarpals, which once again are the bones in our palm, right? Those kind of long bones that sit all the way through like the base of our hand. And then we have our carpal bones. Our carpal bones are our wrist bones. And we can see right here, this is not something that for this particular class I'm going to need for you guys to memorize very much, but just wanted to bring it out in general just so you would be familiar with these terms. We have the scaphoid, lunate, triquetrium, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. Right? Those are the 8 carpal bones right here. And you can see every one of them being pointed out on this picture here. I challenge you guys to be able to take a look at this and say, like, well, how do I know which side is anterior and how do I know which side is posterior, right? How am I taking a look at that? What do I know is what is A, you can see the A and the B down at the bottom of the picture, is A the dorsal side, which is the back of the hand, or is it the palmar side, the front of the hand? There are different ways to be able to take a look at this, so I challenge you guys to maybe try to figure that out, and then when we meet back in person again, we'll talk about that and try to see if you guys are able to do so. There's a fun little mnemonic that I learned from the TV show House that we keep on here. Scared lovers try positions that they can't handle. SLTPTTCH. That is the first letter of each one of those carpal bones. So, if for anatomy class, you do have to memorize that, might not be a bad idea to use a mnemonic device. If you're comfortable with using that one, great. There are other cleaner ones, but that one just entertained me, so I wanted to use that one instead. But yes, so we have a lot of bones, right, and a lot of joints that kind of sit within each one of these, sit between, I should say, each one of these bones as well. So when we take a look, right, we see the distal phalanx, the middle phalanx, the proximal phalanx for each one of those phalanges, right? The bones right up at the top of this picture here, the most distal part. And through each one of those joints, just as we talked about with the foot, through each one of those bones, we have an interphalangeal joint. Right? So between the distal phalanx and the middle phalanx, there's an interphalangeal joint. Between the middle and the proximal phalanx, there is also an interphalangeal joint. With the joints of the fingers, because we have 2 interphalangeal joints, we can name them for where they are on the body. So we have the distal interphalangeal joints, or the dips. Then we have the proximal interphalangeal joints, or the pips. Right, so we have, for all 4 of our fingers, we have 2 joints in each one of our fingers there. And in our thumb, we only have 2 phalanges, so there's only going to be 1 interphalangeal joint. So we don't even need to specify, we just call that the interphalangeal joint. Moving down from there, between the proximal phalanx and the metacarpals, we have the metacarpal phalangeal joint. Right? As we've talked about in the past, there's really not a lot of secrets that kind of come into the way that we name these joints. It's, just something that we're really trying to pay attention to there. When we get down below that, we have the metacarpals into the carpals, carpal metacarpal joint, right? And then last but not least, the actual main wrist joint that we talk about is the articulation between the radius and the carpal joints. So that is the radiocarpal joint, right? Now there are technically several joints, again, 8 different bones. In the carpal joints, there are several different articulations with the radius. Technically, there's one with the ulna. There's articulations between all those different ones. We don't necessarily need for this particular class to discuss a lot of those, the the subtleties and the interactions between those joints or anything like that, but we will just kind of say that, you know, the radiocarpal joint, excuse me, that is the main joint that we're talking about when we talk about the wrist joint. So for the purposes of this class, if I say radiocarpal, just remember that you can translate that in your mind to say that that's the wrist joint itself. A couple of quick terms that are going to help out with the next few slides here. We already kind of talked about a few of these, but I just wanted to kind of bring this up a little bit. So whenever we say anything about digit or digitorum, right, we're talking about the fingers, right? The forefinger specifically. Because when we talk about pollicis, we're talking about the thumb. So in anatomy and in biomechanics, we do differentiate between the fingers and the thumb. But, you know, so there's just different ways to talk about that. So we have the digit for all four fingers. We have the pollicis for the thumb. We do have one muscle that controls just the pinky. So that's digiti minimi, the littlest finger. We have indices. We've always called this our index finger. So that helps to control that. We already talked about anything with carpi or carpal, talking about the wrist joints. And then we have a couple of opposites here, as we've talked about in the past, right? If we have a longus muscle, which is a long muscle, then we're more than likely going to have a brevis muscle, which is a shorter muscle, right? And the same thing, if we have we'll start with superficialis, because we already know that one, right? We have a superficial muscle. And just because I don't know, they might not want to use the term like deepus or whatever the case may be, they used profundus instead, right? Profound, deep. I don't know, maybe it worked for me, but we have a deep muscle there. So if we have a profundus muscle, chances are we're also going to have a superficialis muscle. The longus and brevis, along with the profundus and the superficialis, those are kind of opposites of one another. So we'll be able to kind of discuss those things. So with that said, just by looking at the name at the top of the slide here, flexor digitorum profundus, we already know a decent amount about this muscle, right? We already talked about the fact that that the muscles are named for the most distal joint that they are controlling, right? We know, of course, what flexor means. We know that is going to, you know, kind of contract, whether it's the elbow, the wrist, the fingers, whatever the case may be. It's going to flex those joints. And profundus, right? So once again, from that last slide, we saw that a profundus is a deep muscle, and we also know that there is a superficialis version of that as well. So just by simply looking at these words, we can already tell the flexor digitorum profundus is going to help flex these joints, which means in an anatomical position, it's going to need to sit on the anterior side of our arm, right? Right now, just from looking at that, we don't know whether or not this muscle helps to control the elbow as well. Right, because as we saw from previous slides, there are a few of these muscles that will actually go and they'll attach right to the radius or the ulna, rather than going and attaching all the way down across the elbow onto the humerus. So we don't know about that yet, not from these words at least. But we know that it sits on the anterior side because we're going to get flexion, and muscles can only pull, so we remember that, right? We know that it's going to control the fingers because it gets into the digits. And we know that it's not going to control the thumb because there's nothing about pollicis on there, right? So it's just going to control the four fingers, and it's a profundus muscle, meaning that it is deeper to another muscle, which we also know will be called the flexor digitorum superficialis. So taking a look at the actual slide itself, we once again see everything that we just talked about, right? We can see that it performs flexion of the wrist. It performs flexion of the fingers, flexor digitorum profundus, excuse me. What we also see, though, is that it originates on, I love these terms, proximal 3/4 of the anterior and medial ulna. It essentially attaches onto the front side of the ulna, meaning that, as we can see from this picture, it does not cross the elbow joint, meaning that it does not flex. But just by flex the elbow, excuse me. But when we take a look at these muscles, we can see the flexor digitorum profundus. We already learned a whole heck of a lot just by looking at the name of that muscle. So there's definitely that to kind of pay attention to, as well as we're kind of looking through the rest of these muscles, right? So when we control the hand, right, as we've talked about, the muscles that control the hand are going to be named for the muscles that they help to, for the joints, the most distal joints that they help to control. So we have the extensor digitorum, which we know is going to help extend the fingers, right? We have the flexor digitorum profundus, which is going to help to flex the fingers, right? And along with that, it'll help to flex the wrist. By the way, the extensor digitorum would also help to extend the wrist. We have the extensor indices, right, which would extend our index finger, right? And again, because it crosses over the wrist joint and everything like that, we can see that that picture is also here on the slide. We can see that the extensor indices allows us to be able to just extend our index finger, right? So because we have both an extensor indices, and not that it's shown in this slide, but we have an extensor digiti minimi as well, both of these are relatively small muscles. That's what allows us to do like the rock on sign, right? So we have the ability to kind of do, we have some increased mobility and increased coordination with those particular muscles. Why is that the case? Why do we have an extensor digiti minimi and an extensor indices, but we don't have a flexor version of those? I could not tell you. I do not know what, I couldn't tell you exactly why, evolutionarily speaking, that happened, but we do have those particular muscles which allow us to be able to do that. We also talk about the flexor carpi ulnaris, right? And if there's a flexor carpi ulnaris, and they specified that, then chances are, and this is true, that there's a flexor carpi radialis as well. This is by no means an exhaustive list of the muscles that help to control the wrist and hand. But once again, I just wanted to kind of point out that these muscles are named for their actions, right? They're named for what they're able to do. They're named for the most distal joint that they help to control. So when you're reading through any of these muscular names, that's something that we're really going to be able to help to identify. The point of all of this conversation, though, is the fact that we have an insane level of coordination, right? We talk about the, you might have heard in the past, right, like why humans are able to do things that, other animals aren't doing. And we always talk about the idea of opposable thumbs. And by the way, an opposable thumb means that I can touch my thumb to my pinky, right? Thumb opposition is being able to pull my thumb across my hand. That's really all that means, right? When we talk about opposable thumbs, the fact that I can touch each one of my fingers and have the coordination to be able to do that is, what happens there. But just to say opposable thumbs is what differentiates us from any other animal isn't really telling the whole story, right? In this class, where you've met my dog a few times, love of my life. She's downstairs right now. But when we take a look at dogs or cats or different animals, right, we can see that they just have 4 or 5 or stable joints or stable series of joints that allow them to be able to just kind of bear weight through that particular joint. There's really not much else that they can do, right? But the fact that we have very long fingers, we do have that opposable thumb, and we have all of those muscles once again that come through from our fingers down into our palms, over our wrist, through our forearms, and at times even attached down onto our elbow. It's what allows us to be able to do all of these different motions, right? And we take a look at something as simple as baseball. And honestly, it's funny, I bring up baseball a lot in this class because I think that, while I'm honestly not the hugest fan of the sport myself, I do think that there is just a ton of coordination that comes into what baseball, especially pitchers, are able to do, right? And we take a look at all the different motions that we can do. We look at the four-seam fastball, which is in its own right probably the simplest one that we see out of here, right? Fingers are just a little bit spread apart. That's what we call finger abduction, right? That would be happening, by the way, at the MP joints, right? The metacarpophalangeal joints. We have just a little bit of finger abduction, but we have 2 of our fingers that are a little bit adducted toward one another, and they're flexed. And then our hand is able to just partially flex around this ball and allow us to be able to perform a motion that most of us are really able to do, right? Just that little bit. I don't have a baseball up here with me, but I can do it with a hockey puck, right? Just kind of the ability for us to be able to hold something like this and wrap it around. You can kind of see how the fingers are definitely working in different ways, right? But then we take a look at one of the more complex ones, the change, right? Which is the middle one on the bottom, what most people would refer to as a change-up, right? And in this particular sense, now we can see that his first two fingers are almost wrapped around a circle, and it allows him to kind of grab the ball. Again, a hockey puck doesn't really work in this sense, but it allows him to kind of grab the ball in a slightly different way. That means that the ball is going to hit more of his fingertip as it goes through, and the ball will be a little bit slower as it comes out. That's the benefit of a changeup, is when someone's throwing that, it looks like they're throwing a fastball, but it ends up coming out much slower, and it kind of fools the batter in that sense. But, in this particular process, just the way that someone is holding this ball, just the way that their hands are kind of shaped around this ball, allow them to be able to throw just from here 7 different pitches, right? And now, of course, there are motions at the shoulder that we've already kind of talked about there too. A little bit more external rotation, a little bit more adduction, all that kind of stuff. But for the purposes of this particular part of the conversation, we can see that these muscles, the muscles in our forearms, both on the flexor side as well as the extensor side, allow us to be able to kind of manipulate our hands in all these different ways. It's what allows me to pick something up and kind of move it through my hands. It's what allows me to pick up a pen and start writing, right? It's what allows me to be able to type out all these words on these slides, or to be able to click a mouse button and kind of pull it over, right? So, we can see that, some people have some pretty damn good grip strength, but compared to what most people are able to do with other parts of their body, we don't have nearly as much power, especially power, but we really don't even have as much strength in these muscles as we would have in other parts of the body. But that's really okay, because that's not what these muscles are really designed for. They're designed, especially with the amount of nerves that kind of come into play here, they're designed to be able to help out with that coordination, to be able to help out with us being able to do everything that we need to be able to do with our hands, right? If we go back to that idea of like the evolutionary side of things, you take a look at like a gorilla, for example, right? A gorilla doesn't have the same development of their legs as humans do, right? You take a look at one of the differentiating factors between something like, any of the other primates and humans is the size of our gluteal muscles and the power of our gluteal muscles, which allows us to be able to stand upright, right? But in that process, we look at the arms and the upper body of a gorilla versus the upper body of your average human, and it's by no means the same, because as we talked about throughout this particular section of our course, we're not worried nearly as much about ground reaction forces moving through our arms. So we don't have that same kind of impact all the time on our arms. Instead, what we were able to do is stand upward and actually be able to carry things with our arms for much longer distances. That required the development of a ton of coordination in our fingers and everything like that, so we can once again learn how to do things like hold something very small and be able to, not that I'm really great at this, I'm really bad at that actually, right, to be able to kind of twirl it around in our fingers a little bit, right, to be able to make tools, to be able to do all those sorts of things. We needed a lot of extra coordination, and we were able to sacrifice a little bit of strength to be able to get that. So as we get all of those nerves coming into these muscles in these little teeny slivers of each one of these muscles, right? We have several nerve endings that come into these areas. It allows us to be able to do all of these different really fine motor skills. So that is really the point of the wrist and hand part of this lecture, is we've moved all the way from a ton of mobility and a ton of actions that, our shoulder can do, through some stability and some transitions of the elbow and the forearm respectively, now into the wrist and hand. Again, the theme of this particular part of the conversation is coordination. So that's something that I want you guys to pay attention to as you're kind of moving along, right? Even if you're, I know that everyone's taking tons of notes right now. Whether you're typing or you're writing, I want you to think about the different motions that your wrist is able to do. A little bit of flexion, a little bit of extension. We also have deviations of our wrist, where we go to radial deviation, because our radius is underneath our thumb here, and ulnar deviation onto the other side. So being able to do that. So a little bit of pronation, a little bit of radial and ulnar deviation, a little bit of flexion, a little bit of extension, all those sorts of things. I want you guys to be able to kind of pay attention to that, because that's what allows for all that coordination. By the way, I know that it wasn't a part of the slide here, but I want to just point out again, because it might be on the test, I want to point out again that we have two other motions of our wrist. We have that radial and that ulnar deviation, right? So again, radial deviation goes toward the radius, ulnar deviation goes toward the ulna, and it allows for this kind of frontal plane movement that we can kind of see right here, right? In addition to the pronation, the supination, the flexion and extension, our wrist along with our forearm, because of course that's where the pronation and the supination come from, our wrist along with our forearm allows for all these different really fine motions that we're capable of doing, which once again kind of differentiate us from other animals. So the last thing that I want to show you here, I hope that makes sense to everybody right here. Again, if you have any questions about anything that we talked about in this particular lecture, please let me know. We can absolutely, discuss these different things when we get back into class. But if you wanted to shoot me an email beforehand, just go ahead and do that. As I've mentioned, I'm not going to have full access to my email for these intervening weeks before we meet again. But, I just wanted to kind of point out, a few of these different things, let you know. And if you do have any questions, let me know. If I can answer, I will. If not, we'll talk about it as soon as we get back into meeting in person. So we take a look at this, and the last thing that I want to show you all today is probably the nerdiest slide that I have here, because to me this is a really incredible kind of representation about what we've talked about, throughout the semester, right? One of my favorite terms that we talked about throughout the semester. So, when we take a look at this, right, we can see that the muscles that are moving upward, right, we're looking right here, by the way, at something that we call EMG, or what we call electromyography. It's essentially reading the electrical signals that the nerves are putting into the muscles so that we can see essentially how much neurological control is being exercised over muscles in any given time, right? And once again, we take a look at a baseball pitch and we try to be able to see what exactly is kind of going on in this particular sense at the elbow and into the forearm, right? And we see that, the muscles that are sitting on the top of this graph, the muscles that are actually, as you can see, on the x-axis down here, starting at about 0.15 seconds of the way through this, we can kind of see that we have the flexor and pronator mass, which is again on the anterior side. We can see that we have the pronator teres, which again on the anterior side, and we have the biceps, which of course we know is on the anterior side as well. All of those muscles are starting off slightly more active and becoming very active throughout this pitching motion. On the other side of things, we have the triceps. We have the anconeus, which I didn't really talk about, but that is another muscle that kind of helps to extend the elbow, right? And then we have the last one is the extensor supinator mass. So all the muscles, if you grab onto your elbow right here, all those muscles that if you kind of extend your wrist, you can really kind of feel all that going on there. All of those muscles that are really working for you there, all those muscles start off a little less active and become significantly less active at the same time. So I'm going to pick out two of the easiest ones here, and we're going to talk about the biceps, which is the brown line and moves upward, and the triceps, which is the green line and comparatively moves downward, right? When the bicep muscle grows to activate more so, we see a commensurate drop in the activity of the triceps. And I'm sorry, I think I said it was the green line, it's the purple line. But we see an almost one-for-one decline in the activity of the triceps. So, when one muscle contracts, another muscle must relax, right? We know, of course, that the biceps and the triceps are an agonist-antagonist pairing. So when the agonist contracts, the antagonist must relax. I'm going to pause for a second here and hope that the amount of times that I've tried to drill this into everybody's minds, you'll know what that terminology already is, right? So think about it for a second and think, what is the name of that principle that I just discussed here? Of course, that is reciprocal inhibition, right? We take a look at everything that we're seeing here, and this graph, this is why I get so excited about it, because I'm an absolute nerd. This graph is a literal representation, a literal graphical representation of reciprocal inhibition. When certain muscles contract and become more active, other muscles must relax and become less active. And that's exactly what we're taking a look at here, thus allowing them to be able to stretch out, reciprocal inhibition, as we've all kind of talked about in the past. So once again, hint, hint, might be on the test, right? We take a look at this and we say, what are we looking at here? What is this a representation of? This is a beautiful representation of reciprocal inhibition actually looking in practice. Moving on from there, I know I said the last slide, but this is already a slide that you've seen, so it doesn't count. This is the first slide that we saw for these couple of lectures here, where we're talking about complex coordination requiring all these different motions to occur, right? So now we have moved through the shoulder, the elbow, the forearm, the wrist, and the hand. And in doing so, we have seen how many different motions we're able to do. We see the Red Sox pitcher who is in a lot of external rotation and he's about to go really far forward. We see the same thing in the volleyball serve right there, right? We see she's a little bit more in shoulder flexion than she is, but she's definitely getting a ton of abduction and external rotation. That's going to allow her to really be able to push through that ball and get a lot of force on that. We see something like a softball pitch where we have, right now she's essentially performing shoulder circumduction, which we know is not a single motion, but it's a collection of everything. So she might have gone up into shoulder flexion, and you can see right now she is really externally rotating that shoulder so that she can kind of bring that down, and she's going to get a ton of internal rotation. You're going to slower across the camera here. You're going to get a ton of internal rotation to actually get that pitch offward, right? We can see something like archery down at the bottom, right? And we now know that as someone has to pull back on that string, right? We are getting elbow flexion. We are, of course, at least getting some isometric contraction of our fingers and our wrist, some isometric flexion of our wrist, our forearm, our fingers, whatever the case is. We're pulling backwards like that, but then we're also thinking about the scapular movement, especially in this particular motion, right? The arm that pulls backwards, you need to be able to retract your shoulder blade to be able to get that part going. And many people will say that the best way to perform archery is to push your other shoulder, push your lead shoulder forward. And we, of course, now know that pushing your shoulder forward really means scapular protraction, right? So you're retracting one, you're protracting the other, and now you're really getting into that nice curved space where you're looking right down the arrow and being able to shoot that off, right? So to review, when we were talking about what motions do those, remember, and again, I'm pausing for a second here just to kind of let you think about it. What muscles perform retraction of our shoulder blades? What muscles perform protraction of our shoulder blades? Right? Pausing for a second. But we, of course, know that retraction of our shoulder blades is accomplished through things like the rhomboids, the middle trap fibers, even the lower trapezius fibers, even technically the upper trapezius fibers. But really, we think about it as the rhomboids and the middle traps. Those are the two scapular retractors. And then we can think about on the other side of things, we can think about pushing our shoulder forward into protraction. We have our pectoralis minor that is really good at that, along with our serratus anterior, which for this particular motion is absolutely critical, right? So as you're taking a look through all these things, and again, now you all have your assigned motions, and I want you guys to start working on here. As you're taking a look at all these different motions, I want you guys to think about what you're actually looking at. Now that we've learned about how the body actually moves, as soon as we get back in class together, we're going to take a few different motions and really try to analyze them, put them all together, make sure you all really understand the motions that are occurring, why they're occurring, how they're occurring, what muscles are causing them to occur, all these different things. We're going to talk about all those, but then what I really want you to think about is you look at any of these motions. What is happening in a boxing punch? What is happening in a butterfly stroke of the swimming? I know my face is currently blocking him, but you take a look at a basketball shot and you say, well, what is Steph Curry doing? What is his shoulder doing? What is his elbow doing? What is his wrist doing? What motions, what muscles are performing those motions? And what else is going on in his body? What is his core doing? What are his glutes doing? What's happening at his hips and his knees and his ankles? Right? We know that if all three of those extend at the same time, that's something called triple extension. Is that something we're seeing in a jump shot? Right? These are all questions that I hope that by now you'll be able to answer these questions and be able to say like, well, how does this actually work? the main part of this course is to make sure that you are able to kind of analyze different motions and see, well, if we know what's going on, right? We're not really getting into sports injuries here or anything like that. We have talked about a few injuries along the way and a few different muscular compensations, things like muscular imbalances and stuff. We'll talk about that a little bit more on one of the last weeks of class. But what you're taking a look at here is you want to take a look at any one of these motions and say, what is actually happening at these joints, right? Where is someone radially deviating or ulnarly deviating? Where is someone forcibly extending their elbow? When are muscles being eccentrically contracted to kind of slow these different motions down, right? All of these things start to assemble themselves into really being able to analyze from a functional way their biomechanical process. Hence the term, of course, applied biomechanics. So with that said, right, I want you guys to try to analyze these things. Before the next time that we all meet in person, again, you will all be talking to one another, right, to your partners. And you might have a motion that is actually depicted on this page right now, or there might be a different motion that you were assigned. So I want you to take a look, see if maybe you can find some slow motion videos, or if you are safe enough to be able to do so, create one yourselves. See if there's, someone, a partner or a friend of yours who might also be able to do so. The motion itself does not need to be perfect, but I want you guys to be able to analyze what is going on at those different joints. So with that said, I am no longer on screen. But with that said, again, if anybody has any questions, I am going to have access to my email kind of off and on over these next few weeks. So if you have any questions for me, please let me know. Don't be too upset if I don't get back to you right away. We will make sure that everything kind of works out for everybody as I get back, and we'll be able to talk about any questions you might have. With that said, like I said, you will be watching this video on what was that, Wednesday, I don't even know what the date is. You'll be watching this video on Wednesday the 30th, if not sooner. So if you are watching this video on Wednesday the 30th, know that next week we have our second midterm. And obviously you are able to confirm that on the syllabus. All the dates on the syllabus are completely correct right now. So we're going to be having our second midterm on November 6th. So obviously you're not going into class anyway, but that will be taken online just the same way as it was the first time. And then I'm sorry, we're talking, this is our Monday class. I'm sorry. So we're looking at October 28th as the day that you're going to be watching this, and your second midterm will be on November 4th. Excuse me about that. I was looking at the wrong dates here. But then, of course, the following week after that, November 11th, is Veterans Day, so we have that day off anyway. And then I'm really wanting you guys to take November 18th, if you have the ability to, meet up in person or at least via video, and really make sure that you're able to hone in on those presentations, because they will be done the following week. So yeah, like I said, any questions, please feel free to let me know. I am happy to do everything I can to help you guys out. And I hope you have a good few weeks. I will talk to you all soon.